Living as men do in the senses, they perceive everything fragmented. They see with their egos, and therefore they see their egos, which is the infinite self, but separated in a single body, and therefore separate from other bodies, other things that they see and experiences, other realities in the universe. It's sort of like being in a little rowboat on the ocean, and all you really see are a few waves around you, and you don't see the whole ocean. There are two ways to see the ocean. One is to go up in an airplane. The other is to go down deeper in the sea, get beneath the level of the waves. Now, the Bible and the Gita both speak of a tree. It's a very interesting fact that they use this analogy. You find it repeatedly in Scripture. You find a number of allegorical references to different aspects of the yoga science. The Yuddha and the Pingala are described in the book of Revelation as the tree on either side of the river of life. The chakras in the spine are described again in the book of Revelation as the churches, or in the Old Testament as jewels. I don't have the quote right clearly in my mind, although I have used it, but it's a very interesting one in which he, who I think means Ezekiel, but I don't remember that even, is taken on top of a high mountain and walks up and down the stones, the jewels of light. I don't have that quote exactly, but you see here the image of stones that are jewels, the image of points of light, the image of a reality that you don't find on mountains in the world, but you do find in the spine when you go deep in the spine and you find these centers of energy there, raising the consciousness all the way to a state of union with God. Now, this aspect of the spiritual path is something not known. We often talk here about the universality of religion and of religious teachings. But we usually confine that discussion to such things as moral virtues, moral values, things that all people can share and say, yes, I've experienced that. Everybody knows that it is, as Jesus said, more blessed to give than to receive. At least they've experienced it. If they've experienced it, I should say, they know that it's true. You feel more joy when you can expand your self-consciousness than when you limit it, contract it into the ego. People who are selfish are not happy people, never. People who are generous are always happy. It comes spontaneously and effortlessly. They feel joy. The worldly person cannot really understand that, but as he gets into this, it's an experiment everybody can do. And that's why it's a worthwhile thing to offer everybody. Because everybody who, most of whom think that you really have to go out there and get yours. But if you try it, you find, well, gee, I am happier when I give. Also, you find that no scripture ever says, steal from one another, be untruthful, be unkind. They all say basically the same thing. And so to talk about the universality of religion, it's a help to talk about this aspect that everybody can nod his head and say, yeah, that's true. But there are subtler aspects which we do have some experience of, but they're a little harder to grasp because our minds being outward, not inward, aren't as aware of them. Still, there are certain aspects that we can even so relate to normal experience. For example, every scripture says that speaks of heaven as above and hell as below. You don't find that in science, the sophisticated modern telescope like on Mount Palomar or the Hubble telescope in outer space, you don't find anywhere that telescopes have revealed angels flitting about, nor do modern scientific mining methods ever report devils coming up screaming in protest with an oil gusher. Not only that, but you find that the people on one side of the world, on the other side of the world, let's say, aren't walking around upside down. What is up for them is down for us, but it's still up for them and it's still down for us. It has nothing to do with any geological or sidereal reality. Actually, the scriptures always come down to the individual. It's a curious thing that when Copernicus discovered that the world is not the center of everything as everybody thought, and it's even a misnomer to say that people thought that the world was the center of the universe because they didn't even know the universe existed. Many people in old societies used to think that the stars are sort of little holes in a curtain or an inverted bowl, as Omar Khayyam described it, with these little lights hanging. But the world was the center of everything. Well, Copernicus discovered that that isn't so. You know how recently people discovered that the sun isn't the center of everything? About 1890. Unbelievable. So recently, it was only about 1918, I think, that Hubble discovered that the seeming nebula in Andromeda is really a galaxy. And when I was a schoolboy in England in the mid-30s, a teacher came to me all agog, saying, "Do you realize that this all that we see around us, the stars and so on, are just one system of stars, and that there are other systems? There's that nebula in Andromeda, which is another world, island universe, as it used to be called." And he said there are 2 or even 3 other universes like this in the whole universe. And I thought, gosh, 3. Well, now they know that there are at least 100 billion. The advancement of knowledge, even in my lifetime, but in the last century or 2 centuries, is incredible. And yet, whereas we've gone through a period where scientists, in the name of being objective, would sort of laugh at man's tendency to take himself seriously, laugh at man's idea that certain values are really valid, certain moral things are really valid, certain immoralities are not valid. And they'd laugh at that and say, "Oh, all things are relative. And how do you know it's true? It's true for us. What makes it true for the tigers? A tiger will eat you if he can. Does that make the tiger evil? Does that make his eating a sin? No, it doesn't. The tiger has that instinct implanted in it by nature. Who's to say what's good and what's wrong?" Well, you carry that thought too far and you can get a little dangerous in your thinking. And in fact, many people have gotten so dangerous. There has been a ridiculous confusion of moral and spiritual values in the last century or 2. However, bit by bit, we're beginning to rethink things. For example, yes, Einstein said everything is relative, but he made it relative to one particular fact, the speed of light. He was talking of physics and the speed of moving bodies. And if we want to call things relative, we can't relate them to that. We've got to relate them to something. If you don't relate them to anything, what are you talking about? What are they relative to? You take a little child and he picks up a toy gun and says, "Bam, bam, bam, you're dead." And you sort of smile and think, "Oh, he's cute." You get a grown-up doing the same thing and you think, "Oh, I don't know about this guy. Something's not quite right there." And so you see that moral teachings are relative. They're relative to a growth in human understanding. And that there are levels of understanding that we can grow into them. And that the more you advance in wisdom, the more you see that everybody in the world, whatever his religion, whatever his culture, there are certain truths that are everywhere the same. that morality is true. It's not a matter of opinion. But there's also this fact, that man, who has seemed not to be the center or central to anything, because the world is not central to anything. If you look a little bit more deeply, you see that not only our world, but our own bodies, our own selves, are central to everything that we can possibly know. In other words, as Yogananda put it, truth, divine vision, God, are center everywhere, circumference nowhere. You, as far as you are concerned, are the center of the universe, and you can never understand anything else except you've understood yourself. That's why the Greek saying, "Pantare, know thyself," is the beginning of wisdom. Now, if we go a little further, to know yourself means to go within, to know yourself on a deeper level. Now, it's true that heaven is above and hell is below, but not objectively. It's true because when your energy and consciousness rise, you feel better. When they sink, you feel worse. This is something everybody knows. In every language, I'm sure. I mean, I don't know all languages. I know a number of them, but I imagine all of them say the same thing. It's just too normal a human thing to do. I feel high, I feel up, I feel uplifted, or I feel depressed, I feel down, I feel low. Because our experience, you don't have to explain what you mean when you say that. You say, now look, you say you're low, but you're really not. I mean, I see you standing in front of me on your own 2 feet. You don't say that. You say, I feel high, and you say, well, I see you here, I don't see you flying. Nobody bothers. Everybody knows what you're talking about for the simple reason that this is a universal human experience. When we feel good, our energy and consciousness rise, and we can see it in the posture and everything. People sit straight, they look up, they smile. If they feel depressed, they slump, they look down. Everything about them, even the way they stand and sit and walk, indicates a heavy consciousness. Now, up to a certain point then, these inner truths are basically known. They just haven't been made dynamic to our awareness. There are other aspects too. In the yoga teachings, they speak of the heart, which is really to say the chakra or center of energy in the dorsal center or plexus behind the heart. But the teachings say that in the heart is an energy of love. And we all have that experience in one way or another. Somebody disappointed in love may say, I'm broken-hearted. You never hear anybody saying, I'm broken-kneed. Everybody just automatically feels love here. And when you feel a strong emotion, your hands even go here. When you concentrate deeply, or when you express deep willpower, you knit your eyebrows, don't you? It's just automatic, because the center of willpower, of energy, of conscious concentration is here. I'll never forget an experience that I had with Master at 29 Palms. There was a dog, Bojo his name was, next door. And we were having lunch out of doors, and Bojo came over, and he was straining forward to our sandwiches, and he had his brow wrinkled. And Yogananda said, look at that dog. He's concentrating on the spiritual eye in his focus on the food. Well, whatever you concentrate on, this is the seat of concentration. That's why people of strong concentration often have lines here. And so we see certain correlations. I'll never forget, this is a little bit more subtle, but I was doing a recording of Sri Ram, Jai Ram, Jai Jai Rama, a well-known mantra in India. And just at the end of it, my energy slipped into the cervical center opposite the throat, and I felt an expansion of consciousness. And I told the recording engineer, okay, engineer, let's do it again. And he said, what do you mean? That was perfect. I said, no, there's something else here. Let's do it again. So he said, all right. Basically, you might as well say your dollar. But the thing is, interesting, we used that recording, and sometime later, a friend of mine who had a little child 2 years old, and that child loved to listen to this particular recording. One time his mother got angry with him for something and was scolding him angrily. And he looked up at her and he just, Sri Ram, Jai Ram. But he felt that peace and he wanted to calm her. It's a universal feeling, but it's more difficult to be conscious of it. Nevertheless, you'll notice that people whose energy is more in their lower chakras, they express happiness almost as the way a dog does. You know, a dog wags its tail and wiggles its bottom. And you see people like that too. People who are materialistic, you see them, oh, what? Isn't it so? Whereas people who are joyful, there's a certain upwardness in their expression. That's why in our dancing, I've wanted our movements to be more upward and not in the lower chakras, because those are all associated with the heavy stamping and so on that you find, for example, a very good example in rock music. Rock music and modern popular music is becoming more and more sensual, because like attracts like. It creates a vortex of magnetism which draws to itself. So the more you go that way, the more it'll become that way. And I can't help thinking that sooner or later it's going to just explode in some sort of well, I won't go into that. But I think that the world is headed for something not so pleasant. I don't mean that it's going to be destroyed. I mean, it's got to learn and got to shape up a little bit. It's got too much greed, too much anger, too much violence, too much pride, too much competition. Not enough cooperation, not enough kindness, not enough love. These are what we need to see expressed more. We need to begin by doing it, by having that ourselves. Now this, so far so good. Everybody, to some extent, can relate to this. But there are certain aspects in the inner world that are not so easy to imagine, and we more or less have to take the word of those who have been there. And there are good reasons for taking their word for it. You know, when Marco Polo first went to China, came back from China and India, and was telling these marvelous stories, well, people wouldn't believe it. In fact, for centuries, a synonym for telling a lie was a Marco Polo. They just assumed he was lying. It was a tall tale. In time, people began going there and finding out that actually what he said was so. And so, as you find people, and not just, I know I was talking to a missionary in India, and he was I don't know, just trying to talk about how goofy Hinduism is. Later he told me he teaches Hinduism in his college. But anyway, I thought I'd mention an example that people in nowadays know about, and I was talking about the oneness of religions, and he was poo-pooing the idea, and I said, well, take the example of Ramakrishna, who lived different religions and found God through each of them. And before I got very far talking about Ramakrishna, he threw up his hands. He said, Ramakrishna, it was just, everything he said was a lie. I said, but all the people who lived with him, they all tell the same stories about him. They quote the same things. They experienced it. Oh, they all got together and decided what they were going to talk about. Then they, well, what are you going to do when you come into contact with that degree of self-willed ignorance? Well, so it is that many people, worldly people, might think that all the saints somehow, well, I mean, they lived in different centuries, but in some way they managed to get together and decide that these are the things we're going to say. And so it's traditional for saints to talk about a great light. It's traditional for saints to talk about a great sound, and so on and so on. But they really don't think that it exists. I know my mother was a very spiritual woman, but she didn't know very much. And she had gone to her Episcopal church, and that was basically her religion. And I just couldn't wait to get out of that church. Anyway, here I am. Anyway, she wrote to me one time about some French philosopher who said that the religious life, there's no happiness and no joy in it, but there's a constant flow of gravity. Oh, what a bore. Master used to tell the story of a man who died and went to heaven. And a friend of his died and went to the other place, let's say. And this friend of his phoned him one time and said, well, tell me, what's it like up there? And he said, well, in the morning we pray, chant, and meditate. Oh, yeah? Yeah. Oh, so what do you do in the afternoon? Well, we pray, chant, and meditate. Oh, for heaven's sake. Well, what do you do in the evening? Well, for a change, we meditate, pray, and then chant. And the other fellow said, oh, you ought to come down here. We've got lots of fun going on down here. Well, that's how many people think of communion with God, living in heaven. I mean, what kind of a life would it be if for all eternity, all you'd get to do is strum a harp? I mean, I like the harp, but enough is enough. Why do they speak of harps in connection with heaven? Because in this particular chakra, when the energy becomes centered there and is internalized, you actually hear a plucked string instrument. This is an experience everybody has had. In each chakra, there's a sound emanating. There's a light that is associated with it. In the sacral chakra, the Svadhisthana, there's the sound of a flute playing. That's why legends of Krishna describe him as playing the flute in the forest, luring the gopis to the dance, the Rasa Lila. It's the call. It's the guru within calling you to enter the inner kingdom and explore its wonders. This kingdom exists. It's not boring by any means. In the heart center, why are bells thrilling? Why do we have them in churches? Why is there something in our nature that responds to the sound of a bell? Because from this center, the heart center, there emanates, when the mind is calm, the sound of a deep bell. From this center, you'll hear a sound of perhaps rushing wind. Om has been described that way. It's been described in Acts of the Apostles as a rushing mighty wind. This is one of the sounds, or like wind in the trees, or like a symphony of all sounds from this center, the medulla. So each chakra, the lowest chakra, emanates, since I only left that one out, I should add it, the sound of a bumblebee. But a deep drum is similar to that too. And that's what rock music emphasizes, the lowest chakra. And then sort of echoes into the upper ones, but not very high. People who like that kind of music are attracted to sensual things. There was a woman, a very interesting book that I read, she was one who was constantly depressed. And she used to love to listen to heavy metal rock music. Do you say heavy metal rock or just heavy metal? You know what I mean anyway. I don't know what I mean, but you know what I mean. And I've just heard the expression. And anyway, she got so depressed finally because her energy was down there where the mind becomes depressed. And she tried to commit suicide. Well, fortunately for her, she failed. But during her time when she was really apparently dead, she was out of the body And she suddenly found herself in a very dark place. And I won't go into the experience at length, it's very interesting, but I'm not giving an all-afternoon seminar. It was very interesting that she said later, the vibration of that place was just like the vibration of heavy metal music. And so much so was that when she was brought out of it and realized what she had done to herself, she spent the rest of her life trying to persuade people not to listen to sensual music because it resonates with sensuality and makes you sensual. You know, there are two ways of understanding things. One is intuitively, by your own experience, and it makes sense and you know it's true. But the worldly person says, yeah, but statistics don't show it yet. And so statistics, according to statistics, well, we don't know yet that that kind of music creates sensuality. We don't know that that kind of music makes people violent. We don't know that it has an influence on young people and makes them behave in antisocial ways. We don't know it's true. All the reasoning behind that, of course, is that they like the money they're getting from it. But how don't you know? Of course you know. Your own experience can tell you that when you listen to some music, you feel good. When you listen to other music, you don't feel good. And so it is that human experience everywhere, it doesn't need statistics, it doesn't need surveys, it doesn't need Gallup polls. You know basically what is true and what isn't. So this again is a universal thing, and it's true everywhere, all over the world. It's even true for the animal world, as we see in that dog when he was so focused on something external. The inner world, however, if you do decide to go into it, not into the subconscious. You see, here's the trick, that the energy in the spine, as we've described already, can go either up or down. When it goes up, you feel good, you feel happy. When it goes down, you feel depressed, you feel low. Even the word that we use for it is depressed. Now, that direction of energy, if you go downward, you go into yourself. You separate yourself. It's as if you were no longer on a ship, no longer even in a rowboat, but there swimming in the ocean water and just completely worried about whether you can make it to the crest of this next wave. And so in a sensory life, when you look and try to understand everything outwardly only, not only do you see things chopped, you see them in a very limited form. You see them as they relate to you. You see them as they loom large to your vision because it's so close, far and small if they're far away. So you see everything relative to your own position and your own ego. It's very easy to imagine that anybody who goes within will find nothing if you think that going within just means going into your own subconscious. In fact, that's a way to madness. You go into your own self, cut yourself off from outward realities, and you begin to be influenced by the subconscious, so that in your subconscious imagining, you can see all things as real that are not real at all. This is madness, the inability to relate to a larger reality than your own. However, if you go up, if you try concentrating here and in the heart and raising the heart's energy, if you try to lift your consciousness and absorb yourself in God, you don't just find yourself in another no man's land. Actually, what you're doing, you see, the ego builds all this cocoon around you. The more you sink into the ego, And that is what accompanies when you go downward. The more you harden that cocoon, the more you build a wall around yourself. But when you go upward, what you end up doing is freeing yourself strand by strand of all these things that hem you in. Because what hems you in is the wish that things be this or be that you have a wish for things to be compatible with your desires. And so it is that you can't see things right. You don't see things truly just by seeing negativity. That would be like on Saturday night lying in a gutter thinking that you're seeing reality because you'd see drunks around you and all these things. You see more reality from a mountaintop. You see more reality when your mind has been cleared of all passion, attachment, desire. You find reality the more your energy goes upward. Now what happens then is that it's as if walls were breaking down, like the walls of Jericho with the great blast of the trumpet, the sound of Om, when the walls of ego come tumbling down, and all of a sudden you can conquer the city within, the city of all the delusions that you've got. And it's not sort of a beating around in darkness. Actually, when the saints of all religions talk about light, they're talking of a universal experience. You know, we had an interesting thing. Some years ago, we were building the temple at Temple of Light in Encinitas, in our ashram there. And so we went up to Murano, where they make glassware, and we asked them to do a spiritual eye. And we described the spiritual eye with the round golden aura and the blue field and the five-pointed star inside. You know, the man was excited when he heard this. He said, "But I've seen that in silence." He said, "I've never known what it is." Well, you know, it's something everybody feels. Every now and then I talk about this to somebody. He says, "Oh yeah, I've seen that." It isn't as if some people say, "Well, no, I see it kind of different." It's not a question of you're hypnotizing yourself into thinking it should be this or that. It's when your mind is sufficiently calm, bang, there it is. You're surprised. But it's universal. It's really, if you want to be literal and scientific about it, a reflection of the energy in the medulla and of subtle currents in the spine. I'm not going to go into all of that. The fact is that if you can concentrate on that light, you go out of the body and the ego altogether into a whole different kingdom. Do you know the masters? I know Yogananda said one time, "Sometimes I get tired of having to take phone calls all the time and get interrupted in my flow of thought if I'm writing and so on. So I may go to the movies. And I don't really watch what's going on in the screen. I just sort of close my eyes and I'm in the cosmic movies with planets and stars revolving in space. And people afterwards say, 'How did you like the movie?' And I said, 'Oh, very much.' But they don't know which movie I was looking at. This movie is there. It's far more wonderful. I talked to a man in the zoo at Darjeeling in India one time, and he told me that he was in the higher mountains above the tree line looking for specimens and so on, and they came upon, he and his group came upon a yogi sitting in lotus pose. And he said he must have been sitting there at least 6 months without moving because the nails of his fingers had grown through the branches of a tree right next to him. And he said, we estimated from the length of those nails that that's how long he hadn't moved at all. Because the nails are fragile. If you move your hand at all, they'll just snap off. Now, can you imagine somebody sitting there that long? You couldn't do it if it was boring, I'll tell you that. There's a world inside you. There's a universe inside you. Everything that this universe produces, you are a little epitome of it. In you even, all this exists. You know, just to put it on a literal and mundane level, do you know that in size, the human body is halfway between the largest star and the smallest atom? You're not small, you just seem small, but you're huge. Relatively speaking, relative to what? Relative to yourself. You and your own potential. Do you know there's as much space in your body as there is in outer space? I mean, it takes for the light from our sun, or for I should say from the light of the nearest star to our sun, to reach us, it takes 4 light years. It takes 4 years. That's 4 light years. That means light traveling at 186,000 miles a second takes 4 years to reach us from the nearest star. Just think of all the space in between and how tiny that star is. Well, we can see them up there. They're tiny, apparently, but they're huge. There's much more space in the universe than there is matter, at least as we see it formed in stars and planets and comets and so on. The same is true with our bodies. You are made up of mostly space. Why don't you go through the chair that you're sitting on? Because there's a certain magnetism in the atoms of your body that prevents the body from going through other bodies. But you're not at all solid. You're really only energy. And the little particles, if you could take the space out, Master used to tell us, if you could remove the space from between these atomic particles in the body, your body would shrink so small you might not even be able to see it. It would be as heavy as the body is now, but it wouldn't be visible, or barely visible. It's not even true. It's not even heavy. Physicists have discovered that matter itself isn't even solid. It's a vibration of energy. This world is very different from what it appears to be. And this inner world is just altogether different from what you imagine. Science is showing us that our senses trick us. We see just a few colors. There are many other colors. We see things altogether different from what they really are. The yogi sees things much more subtly than the scientist can. As Yogananda put it, scientists can see the atom and study it from outside. Yogis become the atom. There's an interesting thing. One time, Sri Yukteswar told Master about Master's sister, Nalini, gave him some astrological advice for her. And Master said, "But sir, you haven't seen her horoscope, how do you know?" It's a very interesting thing that Master said there, and you'll find it in the autobiography. He said there is an inner astrology. Somebody who can tune in inwardly finds he can know everybody. He's, as it says in that great poem of his, Samadhi, all thoughts of all men, past, present, to come, are a part of my consciousness. And he showed it, at least as far as I was concerned. All kinds of thoughts that I had, he always picked up on. I didn't have to worry or be embarrassed because I was happy. I wanted him to help me. But it was amazing to me how he would be so specific in things he would say to correct, to inspire, to improve, whatever it meant. Again and again, I'll tell you one funny story. There was an insincere member of our congregation in Hollywood, and I told him that I was going to give the class the next Wednesday, and he said, "Oh, well, then I'll be sure to be there." You know, I didn't like that because I knew he'd be there anyway, and therefore I felt that he was being insincere. And so, to sort of slough off this non-compliment, I said, "Well, would you check everybody's pockets to make sure they're not bringing something to throw?" So bringing vegetables to throw. It wasn't very dignified. You know, Master, a couple of days later, because I often would serve his guests when he had them, and perform the yoga postures for them, and then he and I would sit and he'd talk to me a little bit, and he looked at me this day and he said, "By the way, don't talk about throwing vegetables, it's not dignified." I said to him, "You know." Well, it was on another occasion I said this, but his answer was, "I know every single thought you think." He said it with great emphasis and yet quite casually. But that's an amazing statement. I'm only one person. He had hundreds of disciples. I assume he tuned into them. It wasn't like somebody sitting in a university lab, psychic lab at Duke University, and sitting in front of a screen and concentrating on a let's say a tree, and the other person on the other side of the screen. "I see a ship." And the controller says, "Well, that'll do, because the ship has a mast." It's not like that. He knows it. He knows everything specifically because he is you. That's the whole trick. How could Sri Yukteswar know Nalini's horoscope? Because he was Nalini. A master is everything. When you go within, I don't mean that you cut yourself off from everybody. I don't mean that you become unreal. You become real, everything else is unreal. And in that reality, you are at that central point from which everything manifests. Center everywhere, circumference nowhere. You know that statement. But it doesn't mean lots of centers. That's a tough one to understand. Because my center is your center, is the center of Sirius, of the sun, of Pluto. It's the center of it's the same center everywhere. When you get to your own center, this is what yogis have demonstrated, they're automatically one with everything. Not by reaching out, by being. Now this takes us beyond the realm that I touched on earlier of trying to present the yogic or the spiritual teachings in such a way that people can say, "Well, yeah, I've had that experience," or "I've had something related to it." You haven't had any relationship with this. And yet there are some things that we experience. I remember, look, I tend to talk too much, but forgive me. I mean, you've only got me 3 more weeks and I'm in Italy. This story that I tell in my autobiography, The Path, very interesting. I didn't know these teachings, but there was a time when I realized that formal education wasn't giving me what I wanted. And I began cutting classes until a point I was reached where I hardly ever bothered to come to class. And finally, I just took a leave of absence. I had 6 months to go and never went back. I've always said my education began when I left college. But I had a Greek course that I was taking, and I never studied Greek really, did no assignments, hardly ever came to class, and it wasn't as bad as it sounds. I knew a little bit. I knew words like adelphos, which means brother. After all, I lived near Philadelphia, which means city of brotherly love. Philos, adelphos. So I knew philos also, love. I knew words like ho, which means the, and such things. But really, I was pretty dumb. And whenever in class, the professor, when he was trying to prepare us for the exam, he would say, well, of course there's some people here who might as well not even come to the exam. And everybody looked at me and laughed because it was really an embarrassment. He'd asked me to translate and I really didn't know what to say. But you know, I just was absolutely sure I'd pass that exam. And a week before the exam, I opened the book up thinking, okay, now I'm going to study. I thought, what a bore. I mean, who cares? I'm never going to speak Greek. And besides, ancient Greek isn't modern Greek, and so what's the use? I put it down. I thought, okay, I'll study twice as long tomorrow. The next day, I'll study 3 times as long tomorrow. Finally, holy smoke, it was the last night. And I thought, well, this has got to change. So I hastily read certain passages, and we'd been studying the New Testament in Greek. And so I thought, well, and I had a theory, if you want to be lucky, don't wait for luck to come to you. Expect to be lucky, but go out and meet it halfway. Don't passively wait for it. And I found it worked wonderfully. So I thought, well, this theory, let's see if it works. If I'm lucky, I only have time to read 1 chapter of the Gospels in English. That'll be the right chapter. And it was. So I came to the exam fresh with the knowledge of this 1 chapter. And, but you know what I did before I sat down the night before, I realized I was in pretty desperate straits. And they say that necessity is the mother of invention. Well, necessity was a good mother this time. And I just told myself, you're a Greek. And thinking of myself as a Greek, there was really no problem. Instead of pushing it away with half my mind saying, oh, it's Greek to me, I was absorbing it. And it stayed too. And so when I went to the exam, I thought of myself as being Greek and just sort of brushing up on something I may not know completely, whatever the whole thing was. Do you know, only 2 people in that course passed the exam. I was one of them. And the teacher afterwards, the professor, said, well, shows the benefit of study. Well, I didn't dare enlighten him. But you know, I've seen this again and again, just in my life, that if I want to know something, if I go in thinking of myself as being in tune with it, like in telling myself I'm a Greek, what I think I did, without really knowing what I was doing, was somehow tune in to what it means to be a Greek. We're all Greeks at heart. We're all everything at heart. I've learned this in learning languages. You know, I didn't learn Italian until I was well into my 50s. You're not supposed to be able to speak or learn a language that late in life, but I lecture fluently, really. I was with a group of Americans in Florence a couple of years ago, Mantra Devi, Krishna Das, and a few others, and a woman in a shop said, well, where are you all from? I know you're Italian, but where are these other people from? If you tune in, you can do it. Now that's just a little thing. I'm saying it only to show you that, yes, we can, without becoming great yogis and going into samadhi, we can relate to certain aspects of this teaching and recognize, experience for ourselves that it is true. Now this becomes much truer as you go into deep spiritual states, because you are not the ego. Now when you read about destroying the ego, you think of that as a suppressive thing. It shouldn't be thought that way. It shouldn't be taught that way. Because what you're doing, as Yogananda said in his poem Samadhi again, speaking of that state, he said, described it as I, all flowing I everywhere. Not only is the center of knowing always at the center of everything, one center, but I, the consciousness of I, is at the center of everything. I can't get that thought across to you more clearly on an intellectual plane, but the deeper you meditate, the more you do feel a sympathy for others. You feel a kindness toward them. You understand that they are your own. There's no difference, except superficially. but all of us really are one. And the more you go into it, the more you see that that oneness consists not of some vague, cloud-like knowing, but of a beautiful light, a beautiful sound, a joy and a love past all description. There is an inner kingdom, and it is infinite. And that kingdom is what you are.